You never mean to. Welcome, huge movie fanatic Nate, stopping on by, once again coming your way to do one of these Friday the 13th La La Land CD soundtrack release reviews. Today I'm coming your way to review their most recent Friday the 13th CD soundtrack release. Basically, Friday the 13th, Part 3, the Ultimate Cut, released by La La Land Records. So La La Land Records has quite a history with Friday the 13th soundtrack releases. I think it was 2012 or 2013 they did a limited edition soundtrack CD set, box set release of Friday the 13th 1 through 6 soundtrack release on CD, and I didn't know about it until a little too late, but I was able to get one not long after it came out on eBay, luckily signed by Harry Manfredini, Richard Brooker, and a whole bunch of other people, Adrienne King, and even the director of Jason Lives and his former wife who's in Jason Lives, and possibly someone else, I can't remember, but I got that off eBay not long after it came out. Basically, I would imagine it's 6 CDs, a CD for each of the 6 films, Friday the 13th Part 1 through 6, but then La La Land Records, that was limited to what, was it 1,300 or possibly 1,300, an ungodly small amount of copies for that release. Something, it could be as low as 1,300. That obviously sold out super quick. Knowing they could still make money on the Friday the 13th soundtracks over the years, I'm not exactly sure when because I wasn't paying attention, because they had the limited CD collection. They also put out, I think you can still get all of these CDs, like the first one, like the second, 2 and 3 are in on one CD or a 2 CD set or something. You can still get Final Chapter, possibly New Beginning, possibly Jason Lives Part 6 as well. So these CDs are still available, and from what I understand, basically the whole thing with Friday the 13th soundtracks is supposedly the recording tapes, the master tapes, whatever, of the first, basically, I think it was more or less 5 films, were lost, presumed lost for decades. So basically there was never a way to make an official, for any of the first 5 films, there wasn't a way to make an official soundtrack release for any of them up until like 2009, when Paramount would do basically a restoration of all the films for DVD, and then it'd go on to be Blu-ray, like high definition restorations. And that was the very first time the early films were basically turned from mono to 5.1 mixes. So I guess La La Land Records was able to get the soundtrack, I guess what they call them, stems or something, the soundtrack audio from those Paramount 5.1 remasterings of the early films, and they were able to extensively make more or less soundtrack releases that I was completely fine with. I mean, yeah, it sounded like, a lot of cases, it sounded like some of the instruments may have been in the background because maybe it was made from the surround mix or some kind of thing. Like, it wasn't perfect, but I'd rather have, it was either what we had all the decades leading up to it, which was more or less nothing, or this imperfect version of these early Friday the 13th soundtracks. What do you want, nothing, or this imperfect, mostly good versions of the original soundtracks from the original 5 films? And that initial limited 6 soundtrack CD set, 6 CD set with the 6 films on it, 1 through 6, obviously, was good enough basically to whet my appetite. And honestly, I mostly listened to the first film, but obviously I had the ability to listen to all 6, obviously. And from what I understand, the tapes for 6 were never actually lost. That was the only one of the Harry Manfredini ones that still existed. So that wasn't an issue, from what I understand, to simply make a CD on the never lost and easily found or easily accessible master tapes for the recording of the score from Friday the 13th Part 6. So that's all we had for, like, I don't know, a better part of a decade, and then cut to, I don't know when the hell it was, 2000, it might have been late 2021, early 2022, where either that or it was, yeah, I think that's how it was, something like that, where La La Land Records for the very first time, and I was a little late to the game, not too late to the game, but a little late, too late to get an autograph version. They would release an ultimate cut of Friday the 13th, the original film from 1980, soundtrack release. Basically, their claim was at the time that they found for the very first time since, you know, frickin' the soundtrack or the music for Friday the 13th was recorded, they were actually did find the original recordings and were able to remaster and remix, and that's where you get a little scary when you're talking about remix, because then you get into the whole thing about might not exactly sound necessarily like you remember from the movies kind of thing. I talked about that in my reviews of the, you know, review of Friday the 13th soundtrack CD, the Ultimate Cut and the Part 2 Ultimate Cut. Check out those reviews if you want to know what I think about those. But I'm just simply trying to give you a history of La La Land Records, history with Friday the 13th, and the recent developments of them purporting to have found, after decades of being lost, the original recordings. And, you know, I did obviously get that CD for the first film, Friday the 13th, 1980, right after I found out about it. And I was, you know, upon receiving it, I was delighted, although I did comment on in my review the thing that goes for that, you know, Ultimate CD soundtrack, Part 2 and now Part 3 as well, where, you know, Friday the 13th is my favorite franchise of all time, and the first 7 films are among my favorite films of all time. So needless to say, I've seen them and heard them very, very often, very, very many times. So I know the music, how it sounds in the films very well. And when I watch the films on Blu-ray, I watch original audio, original mono. I'm not a big, you know, 5.1 remix kind of a guy, especially when they add sound effects or take away sound effects like they did in the 5.1 remixes of the early Friday the 13th films. I'm definitely a purist when it comes to these older movies, and I'm an original mono guy. So I've been watching these and hearing these original mono tracks for decades since I discovered the films in the late 80s. So that's a lot of time to get, you know, used to and accustomed to the music. So obviously when you go on to hear the ultimate cuts that are remixed, obviously, and if, like I say, check out my reviews of the first 2 CDs if you want to know my thoughts on those. But it's pretty much just across the board situation where I can simply say that if you want basically exactly what you heard, you know, what you've heard in the movies, you might want those original CDs they put out versus these ultimate editions, because, or the ultimate cuts rather, because the ultimate cuts here or there, it's not that necessarily often, but here and there things, little sounds can sound different than you remember them in the movies, and this kind of thing, and this being here where it shouldn't be there, little things that are changed. So that's just something to just to take note of. So anyway, that was probably, if you're still watching, thank you very much. That was probably a little more of a history than you needed, but obviously it was actually early this year, 2023, I'm pretty sure, when they put out the, so I think it was 2022, like I say, you know, either that or late 2021 when the first CD Ultimate Cut for the first film was released, and then early this year the Part 2, and I was kind of like, okay. Because when the first CD came out, I figured they just found the tapes for the first film and one and done, that'll be it. And honestly, out of all the films, that was the one I wanted the soundtrack, or an ultimate cut version of the soundtrack, the most from. So when it was announced early this year that it's like, oh, well, we found the tapes for Part 2 as well, then it got me thinking. I don't know if I was thinking that I'd have to watch my own review for the review of the CD from Part 2, but one could only assume I'd be like, well, hell, I wonder if they got, you know, the tapes for 3, 4, and 5 as well. And, you know, cut to October, you know, September-ish, October-ish, 2023. Sure enough, Ultimate Cut of Friday the 13th Part 3 comes out on La La Land Records. And this really begs the question, was they just kind of, one can only assume at this point that, you know, the supposed newly found tapes, I mean, well, are they all together? Were they all stored in, you know, grandma's basement, 1 through 5, all in the same little bin or the same tote or whatever? So one can only assume that they're going to do Ultimate Cut CD releases of Final Chapter and New Beginning as well. And I'm not necessarily, I can see them actually probably doing it with Jason Lives. I probably wouldn't get that because I'm not so keen on the Jason Lives music. I like the first 5 films in regards to the music a lot more. Jason Lives just is a little bit, I mean, it's good for what it is, and it's got, you know, brings back memories and stuff, but if they did an ultimate cut of Jason Lives, chances are, I don't know, I'd probably get it. I'm not sure if I'd get it or not. But I definitely like the, you know, Harry Manfredini's scores that he did for the first 5 more than anything else. So if you're still watching, thank you very much. That was a long-winded kind of a history, but I just wanted to just get that out there, just as a basis for what La La Land Records history with the soundtracks for this franchise is. Cut to late 2023, La La Land Records put out their third in the series of Friday the 13th CD soundtracks, Ultimate Cut versions. And yes, I found out about this one soon enough, just like with Part 2 CD, to get an autographed version by Harry Manfredini. Kind of disappointed about how he did it, where it was all sideways, and I'm not exactly sure why the yellow marker was used. I think silver or red would have been better. I'm not exactly loving the color of the marker that was used to sign this, and also I don't know why he had to sign it sideways, but whatever, it's signed, so yay. It didn't cost any more money. You just had to order early, right after the ordering started. So not to mention only that, but they were actually having a 20% off. I think it was actually 21% off sale at the same time, so that was cool. Not only did it not cost any more for the autograph, but at the time they had a 20% or 21% off, so I got it actually for less than normal price, so yay. Obviously, just like with the Ultimate Cuts of the first two CD soundtrack releases, same thing goes with this. Purported to be, newly discovered, or were these all discovered at the same time? Who the hell knows what the official story is? Newly discovered audio recordings that, again, I think it's the same thing, where it's newly remixed and remastered Friday the 13th Part 3 Harry Manfredini music. Now, for those of you who don't know, the thing that's interesting about the third film, and I guess the fourth film as well, if they end up doing an Ultimate Cut CD of that, is for those of you who don't know, Friday 13th Part 1, well, it's not Part 1, Friday 13th and Part 2 were basically more or less, well, obviously the music in Friday the 13th was all original, but more or less the music for Friday 13th Part 2 was all original as well. There might have been a little bit of the music from Friday the 13th in Part 2, I'm not exactly sure, but Part 2, for all intents and purposes, was all new music composed by Harry Manfredini for Friday the 13th Part 2. And if you guys don't know about the history of the score for Friday the 13th Part 3, apparently Harry Manfredini was busy doing something else when Steve Miner was completing Friday the 13th Part 3 and wasn't able to do the music, and initially said he's going to have to turn down Friday the 13th Part 3 because he's busy doing something else, and Steve Miner really had a good idea. He's like, okay, I understand you're doing something else, but how about this? Can you do some new music, preferably for the end, the last portion of the film, some new music for Friday the 13th Part 3, and for all the movie more or less leading up to it, we'll just use, some of the old cues from the first two films. Luckily for us, Harry agreed, and most of the music leading up to the end was all recycled from Part 1 and 2, and basically more or less the point where Chili discovers Shelley, and thereon, I think more or less is all new music that was composed and recorded for Friday the 13th Part 3. Initially, when I heard about this Part 3 soundtrack Ultimate Cut release, I was like, God, do I even need that? Because most of the music is from the first and second films. But then I'm like, there was some gems. One of the things that was great about the releases of the CD, Ultimate Cut releases of the first two films, was that there were bits and pieces of never heard before music, and that was really, really, really that was some of the biggest reasons to actually get those Ultimate Cut CDs for 1 and 2, and that was more or less the main reason I got this CD as well, because just like with the first two, this one also contains previously unreleased, unheard music that was composed for Friday the 13th Part 3, and unfortunately, in my opinion, compared to the never before heard stuff from like this first film and the second film, like the never before heard music in this Ultimate Cut CD for Part 3 is the lesser of all three of them. Like, it's cool to hear the extra stuff, but honestly the extra stuff is so goofy, in my opinion, that it's kind of like doesn't really even matter. One thing to note, obviously one of the classic tracks from this movie is the opening credit song, more or less the disco version of the disco Friday the 13th song for the opening credits of Friday the 13th Part 3. I'm pretty sure that the version that's featured on this CD, or like the second track or whatever the hell it is like a longer version, not necessarily the version in the opening credits. There's actually 3 different versions of that same song. For some reason, it's like, we know it's in the opening credits, but for some reason It's on the CD also as end title, which makes sense, but also under a bonus track, it's this Rock Bottom here performed by Hot Ice, and you know the theme from Friday the 13th Part 3, the second track, is also billed as performed by Hot Ice. So I don't know why this last track here, which is 31, Rock Bottom, I don't understand why, and that's like 5 minutes long, so it's like that classic disco Friday the 13th theme is, I don't know why they're calling it Rock Bottom, and that version on here I think is the longest version, clocking in at 5 minutes and 9 seconds. Second track is like 3 minutes and 21 seconds if I'm seeing correctly, and the end title is 2 minutes and 48 seconds. So it's all like the same track, just different lengths. So I'm not a huge fan of that anyway, other than just like the goofy aspect of it. But yeah, so that's I'm pretty sure that the second track is actually longer than the opening credits are in the film, just in case anyone out there is wondering. Yeah, out of all three of the first Ultimate Cut releases, I say that the three of the first because I can only assume there's going to be a final chapter and a New Beginning one coming as well. This is the in my opinion, like if you've got the original La La Land Records CD, which I think you can get now, double CD set with part 2 and 3, I'd say you're pretty much good, and you might not necessarily need to get this one in my opinion, but if you really want like all the bells and whistles and the extra stuff on this CD that never before heard, I guess you can get it. You've got my permission. The standout tracks that are never before heard for me that I can remember is this one, 25, Canoe in the Lake. I think that's the one, I'm pretty sure that's the one where it's just like, in the finished film there's really no music of her in the next morning in the canoe. I call it the pond, the canoe in the pond. Is there no music, but that, you know, presumably this track was actually to belong there when it fades in the next day and Chris is in the canoe on the pond. That's probably where this music goes, and honestly it's, you know, it's like fairy, it's almost like, you know, fairy music, or it's kind of dreamlike or whatever, and I can see why it wasn't used, if, you know, because it's not that amazing honestly. But if you want to hear like I say, an unused cue from the third Friday the 13th film, it's definitely on here and definitely hearable. But like I say, unlike the unused stuff from, you know, the Ultimate Cut of the first and second film on CDs, the unused stuff on this CD was the least interesting in my opinion. One of the bonus tracks here, never before heard, is Shelly and Vera Bug Out. One can only assume this music was after the confrontation at the store when they're, you know, when he backs up accidentally and smashes into the bikes, and then the guy breaks the window, then he turns around and runs over the bike and drives away. I was really surprised to hear this track, and I'm, you know, part of me wants to try laying it over the scene and see if I can figure out where it goes and where it starts and where it's supposed to end, but you will not believe, for any James Bond fans, you will completely not believe this track, because it is like completely like a James Bond, you know, kind of a, just, well, it sounds very much just like a James Bond track, and it's just unbelievable that, I mean, I don't know if you could even have gotten away with this, because it's so close to James Bond. Obviously it's probably supposed to be like a lighthearted kind of, you know, Shelley becomes the hero, or some kind of weird James Bond kind of, it's very strange to me, and you know, it's probably the most interesting of the unheard tracks on this CD release, and I was like just dumbfounded. I was like, wow, because when it starts it's not necessarily so much James Bond, but then by the time it really gets going it's like, wow, that is basically as much of James Bond as you can probably legally get without even being, I mean, it might even be too close. And maybe the whole reason it wasn't included is because it was too close. But let's face it, I don't think it really necessarily would fit with the scene anyway. But, you know, out of all the unused tracks on this CD, that's probably the standout one, and just the one that makes you go, whoa. You know, I suppose that just hearing that was kind of almost worth the price of getting this CD itself. So what the hell. So granted, I only heard this Ultimate Cut CD once, but one of the other things that was kind of a negative takeaway from it is that the bit of the music where Chris hides in the barn and Jason comes in the barn looking for her, and it's just like the really cool, you know, you know, just kind of a more of a subtle, because it's been all action and chase scene up until this point for a while, and it's just kind of music just calms down for a while he's looking around, and just like a really simple kind of music going on. I was kind of disappointed because initially when I heard it, I'm like, God, that seems like that doesn't belong there. And I went back and looked at the movie and then listened to the La La Land's original release from that bit of part of the movie where Jason comes in the barn looking for Chris. And sure enough, it wasn't originally there in the movie or their first Part 3 soundtrack. But when he like comes in and starts looking in the barn, just out of nowhere, there's like just a and it's just like, that's one of the things that it might be one of the most blatant like things that wasn't supposed to necessarily be there, or if it was supposed to be there, if it was originally there and was something that they took out or whatever, I guess you could say that. But I mean, it's kind of like that's why the whole remixing aspect of these first 3 CDs are a little bit of an issue, because if you're dealing with people that don't necessarily know how it's supposed to sound or where things are supposed to go, if they're dealing with all kinds of separate elements and stuff, you end up with a situation like that where it's just, and that's that's part of the new material that was written and recorded for Friday the 13th Part 3 that Harry Manfredini did. It was the last section of the movie, and that, if you're going to screw something up, like screw something up from the earlier part of the movie. It's a part that I really kind of like too, where it's just, after all the chasing, it's just like we just kind of calm down, and it's just like just these and it's just like all of a sudden this just like it was just thrown in there by some teenager or high school student, just like, oh, this is too boring, let's jazz it up a little bit. That was the kind of feeling that I got from it. So while these Ultimate Cut CD releases are cool, and I think they do more or less sound better than the original CDs they put out, the pluses are these, in a lot of cases you get more material, they sound better, but the negatives are some of the stuff doesn't sound like you remember it sounding for all these decades that these movies have existed. So my recommendation would be, gosh, if you've got, the original Part 3 CD that they put out, you don't necessarily need this one. If you want to hear the James Bond, basically Vera and Shelley bug out track, and the other track on the pond and the canoe or whatever, and the 3 different versions of Rock Bottom. I don't know. I don't understand why the Friday 3 title track is called Rock Bottom on the soundtrack. It's just there's definitely weird aspects about this CD release. That's for sure. Do I regret getting it? No, because just hearing that Vera and Shelley bug out was cool, and even though I don't love the track of the canoe on the lake or the pond or whatever, I mean it's cool to hear it. Just hear something that was written for the movie that never made it in. So I don't regret buying it, but definitely out of the first 3, like I say, we can only assume there'll be more of these Ultimate Cut soundtrack CD releases. Out of the first 3, I think this is the one that is least, like if you've got the original CDs that they put out, this is the one that is less needed, because a lot of the stuff is rehashed music from the first 2 films. Just like the CD releases of the Ultimate Cuts for the first 2 films, I'm not crazy about the cover art. Honestly, I'd rather just have original poster art on the covers, but ironically you do get original poster art of Part 3 on the back, so at least it's there in some respect. I don't know if it's a copyright issue that they can't just put it on the cover, but obviously they also want to, when you're putting out a new CD of a quote-unquote Ultimate Cut, I guess you want to distinguish it from any CD releases that have come before it, so I guess new cover art is inevitable. It could be worse, but it could also be better. They're trying to do you got to give them credit for trying to do that, 3D aspect with the bloody machete coming at you, I guess. But just the floating hockey mask there and the machete and the glass shards, it's whatever. Got a 23-page booklet that features, obviously, just like with the first 2 Ultimate Cut soundtrack releases on CD, it features the kind of behind the scenes, little bit of history regarding the soundtrack for this film, and also I would imagine, I didn't read it all or anything, but I would imagine the processes involved in doing the remaster for this Ultimate Cut CD soundtrack release. actual compact disc looks like this. Friday the 13th Part 3, the Ultimate Cut, music by Harry Manfredini. Basically the cover art minus the hockey mask and the bloody machete coming at you in 3D, just light black with a little bit of discernible breaking glass shards coming at you, presumably in 3D. Underneath where the CD is housed, really cool shot of Harry Manfredini, presumably working on Friday the 13th music, but working on some music when he was younger, that's for sure. Guess that about does it for my review. If you're still watching, thank you very much for doing so. In closing, am I expecting a final chapter in the New Beginnings CDs? Probably at this point. I think one can safely assume that, like I say, maybe all these were just found in one box or a bunch of boxes in the same place. Who the hell knows what the official story is, but now that we've got the first 3 films, one can only assume we're going to get final chapter and New Beginning and possibly Jason Lives as well. As you may or may not know, there's already a New Blood Friday the 13th Part 7 soundtrack CD released by La La Land Records, and if you guys pay any attention, that'll be my next video that goes up reviewing that CD as well, so yay for that. Guess that pretty much does it for this review. If you watched the whole thing, wow. Thank you very much for doing so. Hope you guys enjoyed the review. And as always, we'll catch ya on the next video.